Hey listeners, Dan here. A couple of weeks ago, I had an episode with Karen Murphy from Facing History and ourselves, and we talked about ways that we can empower teachers and students to have productive conversations about important but sensitive topics like race and the election. Consider this part two of that, talking with Jenny Spiegler from the Anti-Defamation League, another organization working really hard on this and providing some excellent resources. So I encourage you to have a listen and go back and listen 2 episodes ago and pair these two together to really prepare yourself for the important conversations we need to be having with students. All right, on to the show.
I do find, and then I think we all find that it is particularly challenging for teachers, and most teachers are white. 80% of the teachers in the teaching force are white. And one of the first white privileges that white people have is that we don't have to talk about race. So, most teachers are not necessarily accustomed to talking about race. They may have, as you said, discomfort with not really feeling like that's something that they can talk about.
Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. Today on the show, I'm joined by the Director of Curriculum and Training from the Anti-Defamation League, Jenny Spiegler. The Anti-Defamation League is a leading anti-hate group. If you've heard of them, you've probably heard of them in the vein of fighting anti-Semitism. That's actually initially how the organization started over 100 years ago. Today, it's about stopping all forms of hate. And they've got an incredible bank of educational resources. They're doing some really important work, really timely work on helping teachers and students pick apart, discuss race, white supremacy, racism, anti-Semitism in constructive ways that tap into current events and history. As I said at the top of the show, if you listened 2 episodes ago, you heard my conversation with Karen Murphy of Facing History. Anti-Defamation League is doing a lot of the same work, albeit with different resources. And I think this is a really important conversation we're having right now. And frankly, I think this is one of the most important conversations we'll be having. I was having a conversation in class just recently, and we touched on the nation's history, voting rights. We're talking about voting rights, about poll taxes, literacy tests, and there was a moment when a student was talking about race and racism, and he just kind of was stumbling over his words, and kind of his brain was kind of short-circuiting, and everyone kind of had an uncomfortable laugh, and we had a conversation about how hard it is to talk about these things. But if we can't even acknowledge that it's hard to talk about these things, I'm not sure where the progress is going to come from. And this conversation here with Jenny Spiegler is a really good one if you're an educator who wants to have those hard conversations to help our students. They've got incredible resources at the Anti-Defamation League. So sit back for the next 20 minutes, enjoy this conversation, and then roll up your sleeves and see what they've got at their website and if it can work for you and your students. All right, here's my conversation with Jenny Spiegler. Well, Jenny Spiegler, thanks so much for joining me today on the podcast. I want to start with a couple headlines about here in California. The LA Times, just in the past week, has run a couple headlines. For the 5th year in a row, hate crimes rise in Orange County. Violent hate crimes in LA hit highest level in more than a decade. White supremacist acts jump 38%. And I just want to jump right into this. Where do you see education playing a vital role in issues like this, in preventing issues like this?
Hi, Dan. Thanks so much for having me. Yes, we see hate incidents, hate crimes, vandalism, all those kinds of things that are happening in society in schools as well. And we see very much that the most important thing in education is to really educate young people about bias and about discrimination. And it really starts, we have something called the pyramid of hate. It really starts at the bottom with biased attitudes and biased acts that happen every day in society and in schools. And then, it can escalate when it's not interrupted into these more serious and physical and violent acts of bias and hate. So
Mm.
we really want to, in education, educate young people from a very young age to think more expansively about the world, about other people, and about how to challenge bias in themselves and in others and in society. That is really our goal.
And you work at the Curriculum and Training Division at the Anti-Defamation League. You want to talk just a little bit more broadly about the mission of the ADL and then maybe a bit more specifically about your division?
Sure. Our mission, which has been our mission since 1913, is to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and secure justice and fair treatment for all. And so we do that through our 25 regional offices around the country where we engage in advocacy, investigation, and education. So we have a center on extremism that really works on some of those issues, a civil rights department that talks and works a lot on hate crimes. And then within education, we have programs, trainings, and resources for K-12 schools and colleges and universities that really, the goal is to help the next generation challenge bias in ourselves, in others, and in society. So, we do that through our programs, through our training for schools, for educators, for students, and for families.
What would you say is the biggest challenge right now that you see in education in terms of reducing bias and helping students come to terms with these difficult topics?
Yeah, I mean, there's three intersecting things happening right now. One is obviously the pandemic, and so many young people are learning at home by themselves and with their families. So we've been really working a lot on bringing the concepts and the training that we normally do in person online. Then, of course, we have, which really got ignited over the summer, but that's been happening for several years and more, just this public conversation about racial justice and other issues of bias and oppression. I will say we have an online lesson plan on Black Lives Matter. It's been getting the most um, hits really for the past several months, like every day. And we're selling more anti-bias curriculum more than ever before. And also another issue which intersects with anti-bias education is social emotional learning because, it was definitely a priority in schools before, but it really helps young people have those hard conversations. So, they really need to really understand like how to create a positive environment in the classroom so they can talk about these hard issues, to be aware of their feelings and the feelings of others, to work collaboratively, to actually create some caring in the classroom so that they can hear other points of view, which are sometimes hard when there's controversy and when there's disagreement and when things are heated or when they affect young people personally, which many of these issues do. So, I think the intersection of those three things happening right now are really challenging, and we're trying to meet those challenges as best we can.
We can't just, as teachers, we can't just suddenly start taking on challenging or sensitive topics if we haven't done the work. We haven't laid the groundwork for a classroom culture that values perspectives. And and my observations, and I'd be curious if you agree with this. My observations tell me that one of the biggest barriers to having these important conversations that actually move, that help us progress as a society in the classroom is the comfort level of teachers, and that teachers often, at best, don't feel comfortable talking about these issues, and but even worse, often feel quite defensive and don't feel like should even be talking about them at all. And I wonder if you've observed in your work anything like that.
Definitely, for sure. I think some of that groundwork is something that's is sometimes ignored. We actually, I think also talking about bias and oppression, there needs to be it needs to be scaffolded. So we have, in our framework, we first talk about identity. And, we have multiple identities, my identity, your identity, then we move to differences and really being able to interpret differences. Then we look at bias. How do we understand what bias is? What is all the language around bias? Really understanding bias, and then how do we challenge bias to bring, social justice? I do find, I mean, I think we all find that it is particularly challenging for teachers, and most teachers are white. 80% of the teachers in the teaching force are white, and one of the first white privileges that white people have is that we don't have to talk about race. So, most teachers are not necessarily accustomed to talking about race. They may have, as you said, discomfort with not really feeling like that's something that they can talk about. They might not have, background in talking about race and racism. They may feel like they need to know all the answers. Teachers often feel like, I really need to be an expert on this to bring this to young people. Or they might feel like they could say the wrong thing or they're going to make mistakes. And some people, still believe in, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. I think they feel like if they don't see it, that makes them not notice it and not racist. And we know that's not the case, but many people still believe this. So I think there's also a concern that if they do discuss it, that bias will emerge, that controversy and conflict may emerge, and that will be challenging too. So, that's why setting group guidelines for safety and respect, for really creating a classroom environment where students can talk about their own experiences and people can listen and hear about those experiences and share their own, is very important. And at the same time, it's not really the student's responsibility to share their own experiences as a way of bringing those topics to the classroom. The teacher can bring in those voices in a lot of different ways. But yes, I think it's particularly challenging. There was just a study that came out, I think it was like in the last few days, that 90% of school superintendents said that conversations about race and equity were extremely important, but only 21% said that they were very well prepared for that responsibility. So that's coming from superintendents and then down to principals and then to teachers. So, that's one of the reasons we have programs, training, and lots of resources to really help them be able to manage those conversations and give them resources and tools to do so.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up that study on superintendents. I was going to go there next about school leadership because, of course, as teachers, we're also balancing the demands of the curriculum, possibly any testing. We have to think about the reaction of our community, our parents, and so I was going to ask that about what can school leadership do to make it clear to teachers that A, they want teachers talking about these issues, and B, making them or empowering them to do so. And I think you kind of alluded to that already. You have a lot of resources, and maybe you want to talk a bit more about how we can empower leaders to empower teachers.
Right. I mean, I think it's important that principals make it a priority. So that's important that they communicate with parents that, and the community that we are going to address these issues. And we did see a lot of that in the late spring, um, when Black Lives Matter was really at the forefront of a lot of conversation. You would see a lot of principals sending letters home. Even in my daughter's school, there's a letter home. This is a priority. This is important. And at the same time, not just saying it's important, but providing professional development time, professional development dollars, um, an openness for teachers, and setting a priority for them that this is something we want you to integrate into your curriculum. It's more challenging as students get older because there are so many demands, like you said, testing and covering the curriculum, at the same time, they're intellectually very capable and interested in talking about those issues. But we feel like we can start with elementary for sure. We have elementary curriculum, and it's very important to start early. Children begin to develop prejudices at a very young age. They notice identity, they notice their own identity and the identity of others, by the age of 3 or 4, and can even begin to develop biases at a young age. So, and with that, another reason it's so important is because the increasing diversity of our schools. As of 2014, we had more students of color than white students, and that's going to continue to change and increase over the years. And so it's important that the teachers, are really creating culturally responsive curriculum and also are bringing these issues that are important to all students, but definitely students of color, to the classroom and integrate them.
You brought up that most teachers are white. Um, and I want to kind of drill down on this a bit. Over the summer, your organization posted a really great resource addressing the challenge of white teachers talking about these issues with white students in environments where maybe some people are thinking or saying, but this doesn't affect us. Why are we talking about this? What can white teachers do in situations like this where most, if not all, of their students are white and maybe feel disconnected from the lack of social justice in communities around this country?
Yeah, I think that this is an important issue for all young people growing up in our multicultural and diverse society. And so, first and foremost, getting professional development for themselves, which is what we talked about just a minute ago, and really having principals prioritize that. I think you can have a mindset with the students of we're going to learn together. It's important to again set up those guidelines for safety and respect, but also help students understand that when we talk about these issues, especially if they're not used to talking about race and racism, that they need to, along with the teacher, accept that there's going to be discomfort and that there's going to be uncertainty and that it's a process and there aren't easy answers. And acknowledge that, talking about race and racism, just like many hard topics, is a process and it takes time. I think we want to help them think about opportunities to learn about others and foster empathy. And if that experience doesn't exist in the classroom, bring that perspective in through books, through videos, through movies and articles and stories by teens. And so that you bring those voices, if those voices aren't in the room, you bring them into the room. I do think it's important to talk about systemic racism and systemic bias. And sometimes if you start there, students might be less defensive when they're thinking about what they're personally doing. But it is important to address white privilege, which is, I think, hard for many teachers. And I had suggested in that resource that one way to do that is to maybe start with another form of privilege, like age privilege. So all young people know what it feels like to not have age privilege and to experience discrimination based on their age. And sometimes if you can start with that, and then get them to see, there are other elements of privilege that we all have, and that because we have multiple aspects of our identity, sometimes we are in a privileged group and power group, and sometimes we're in a discriminated group.
Mm.
So, start with something that they're all kind of on the same page and on the level with, and then move into other areas that may be harder for them to address.
As teachers, we love it when our students take action. It's sort of it's when we feel as teachers like we have made a difference when our students take action on their own with what they've learned. What action would you hope students take away from these conversations, maybe after using or viewing resources from ADL? What kind of action would you hope students would take?
That's critical. We always, no matter whether the child is 5 or 15, it's so important to really think about something they can do that's real, and that is on their developmental level. So, that could be, if we're talking about racism, it could be, in a early childhood classroom, bringing more books into the classroom that have more stories about people of color. At older ages, it may be that they want to do something in their school, a teaching. They want to post important information on social media. Maybe they want to get involved in a racism or Black Lives Matter group in their community or in their school, or look at what some of the issues of bias are happening in their school. So I think it really depends. I think it's important to give a variety of options, right? Because some are small and modest and fine, and some are more long term, and it depends on how much interest they have and how much time they have. It's also helpful if they help to come up with the ideas. I think it's hard when we're telling them as adults or as teachers or as principals, this is what you should do. It should really come from them. Both the initiation of doing something and what that action is, we can help them, right, as the adults or educators in their lives, but it's important that they come up with ideas themselves.
And students, of course, are so plugged into social media. What's your view of social media when it comes to these issues, especially the Anti-Defamation League fighting anti-Semitism and racism? What's the balance sheet look like for you with social media?
Right. I mean, there's obviously, we've talked about all the harm that's caused by social media, and there is a lot of that. But I think it's amazing, and it's created amazing opportunities for young people to connect with each other. My daughter got involved in a lot of work last year, and was using social media and Instagram to meet new people, and then they would have in-person events, and then they would have, when the pandemic happened, they would have then digital events, and these were people, some of whom she knew and some that she didn't. So I think on balance, it's such a great thing, and it's where teenagers live. So we can't dismiss it at all. We need to help them um, discern what's positive about it and what's really challenging. We actually do a lot of, another area of our work is bullying and cyberbullying and online hate, and helping young people kind of navigate all those digital spaces. But we never want to give the impression that we think it's a negative thing. There's so much positive that can come, so much organizing, meeting other like-minded people, sharing important messages. So I think it's a balance. We need to be mindful that there is that negative, hateful stuff out there, that they need to navigate. So it's a both end.
Yeah. For a teacher listening that is interested in using some of your resources, or at least just beginning to immerse themselves in it, where would you recommend that teacher start?
So we have, as I mentioned, 25 regional offices. So if you're in a certain place in the country and you want to connect with training or programs, you can connect with that regional office, which you can find on the website. But we have a whole slew of online resources that are all free. If you go to adl.org/education, you'll go straight to them. We have online lesson plans that are called the Current Events Classroom, which take current events and that intersect with our anti-bias framework. We have something called Table Talk, which is a family discussion guide about some of those similar current events. And then we have Books Matter, which is an online bibliography of children's and young adult books that intersect with these same issues. And then we have other resources too, especially for our early childhood educators. We have a question corner, which is all about bias, diversity, and injustice questions for parents or caregivers of very young children. So there's a lot there to choose from, and you can also sign up for our newsletter, and you would get information about anything new coming up.
ADL is pretty responsive to current events. Your resources are not only thorough but also very up to date. I wonder, what's the process that you take for developing resources and curriculum in such a way that you are keeping up with fast moving events and important topics.
Right. Well, the great thing about ADL is we have several different departments. So we have a civil rights department. I was just working with them on a lesson about reparations. So we're connecting with the issues, and so many election issues have come up, obviously, recently, that we then, connect with them and get their help in thinking about both what teachers are interested in teaching about and what's coming up in schools and getting their expertise. And then we also have a center on extremism, and we've created resources on those topics as well. And, it's a pretty quick process, especially for issues that are, coming up right here now. We've done a lot on immigration and issues at the border, child family separations, all those kinds of issues, are important to bring into the classroom, and teachers are really looking for them very quickly, as quickly as they can. And sometimes they'll just use an article or a video from the lesson or the whole entire thing. So you can take it apart or use the whole thing as you see fit.
Yeah, I'll agree with that. Having used your resources, it is in a way, has a very nice modular feel to it, where you can use the whole thing or you can pull out individual resources depending on exactly what you're doing that day. Jenny Spiegler, I want to thank you so much for joining me today and sharing this. And I'm going to be linking lots of your work in the show notes so listeners can check it out. And it's important work you're doing to help students move us all along in the future.
Great. Thank you so much. It was great to talk with you today.
A big thanks to Jenny Spiegler from the Anti-Defamation League. If you've made it to this part in the podcast, if you've listened all the way through, then you're probably pretty interested. And what I've done is in the show notes, I put links to some of the resources we discussed in the episode. If you go to just adl.org, that's their landing page. You might have a little trouble. There's so much going on at that website. They cover so many different things. So I'm actually going to put in the show notes some of the specific links that might help you get started having those conversations with students, feeling empowered to have those conversations, and being willing to put up with discomfort, frankly, and getting to enjoy the fruits of what happens on the other side of those difficult conversations when you see students who are willing to acknowledge this nation's history, talk about this nation's history, talk about its impact on today, and what we can do to improve and what we can do in this country to stop racism, stop anti-Semitism, and start moving towards the ideals of this country. Lofty terms, but that's ultimately, I think, what we're trying to do in education. Thanks for listening to What's the Big Idea? And I appreciate any comments you want to leave on Twitter at Big Idea Ed. I'd love to hear if any educators out there are using Anti-Defamation League's materials or Facing History's materials and how they're doing it. All right. Check us out next time.
Hoy es el día que extraño